afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kristen Watson, investigator for the City of Iowa City Human Rights, and this is the latest in our Lens webinar series. Today we have Dr. Basima Tewfik. She's the Assistant Professor of Work and Organization Studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and she's speaking on her research regarding imposter thoughts in the workplace. An award-winning researcher and professor, Dr. Tewfik has been named as a thinker to watch and a best business school professor under 40. So we're very excited to hear from her today. As always, Dr. Tewfik's thoughts are her own and not indicative of the official policy or position of the city. A few housekeeping details. This program is going to be available on City Channel 4 within probably about a week. And once posted, it will remain up for 1 month and then be removed. So if you know somebody who wasn't able to attend today, or if you have to log off early or something, you can find it on Channel 4 as soon as staff has a chance to post it. And thank you for allowing that, Dr. Tewfik. So also, it will be a bit of an interactive session, and Dr. Tewfik will be outlining the parameters for that as soon as she starts her presentation. So welcome, Dr. Tewfik.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure. My name is Basima Tewfik, and I'm really excited to be presenting my latest research to you guys called Rising to the Challenge, the Interactive Effect of Role Overload and Workplace Imposter Thoughts on Effort and Subsequent Job Performance. This topic is popularly known as imposter syndrome, and I'm going to dig into that in a little bit. For those in the chat, if it looks like I'm staring in various ways, it's because I have multiple screens on, and I'd love for people to put in questions or comments in the chat. I'll be able to monitor that throughout the presentation, or even raise your hand, and happy to call on you. Towards the end, there's going to be a little bit of an interactive thing if you're down to put some thoughts into the chat. So with that, let's get started. So whenever I present on this topic, I like to start with a little bit of self-reflection. So no need to publicly self-disclose, but I'm curious if you've had any of the following thoughts at work or in school. Others think I have more knowledge or ability than I think I do. People important to me think I'm more capable than I think I am. Other people see me more positively than my capabilities warrant. I've received greater recognition from others than I merit. I'm not as qualified as others think I am. Maybe you had these thoughts when you first took on a job. Maybe they struck you during a job interview. Regardless, if you have had any of these thoughts, you're not alone. In fact, research shows that 7 out of 10 working adults have claimed to have entertained these thoughts at least at one point in their careers. Research in management and psychology, or at least most of the research, traces these thoughts to what is popularly known as imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, which tends to categorize people as imposters or not. And if you're an imposter, it's generally bad news. So the research in psychology would suggest that this is associated with things like decreased self-esteem, decreased psychological well-being, or increased negative behaviors like denigrating yourself or handicapping yourself. The limited work in organizational behavior or management, which is essentially the psychology of the workplace, would suggest that it's associated with decreased job attitudes like lower satisfaction or commitment with your job. In general, the prevailing wisdom that emerges from all the current research would suggest that, hey, if you're experiencing the imposter syndrome or the imposter phenomenon, this is bad news. It's uniformly harmful. Indeed, you can observe, and I'm sure you all have, a cognitive industry of self-help books and articles and management tomes that all warn of the dangers of feeling like an imposter at work. So case closed, right? We know it's a bad thing. It's probably bad to have. But what my research and my own scholarship shows is maybe we don't actually have the whole story. So recent scholarship has begun to challenge this prevailing wisdom, showing that the phenomenon can have upsides. So in one of my papers published in 2022, I studied finance professionals as well as doctors in training, and also ran 2 experiments to look at causality. And I found that actually experiencing this phenomenon was associated with increased interpersonal effectiveness. So that is People who seem to have this phenomenon or have these thoughts were rated by their colleagues and patients as more interpersonally effective. So, for example, in one study with the doctors in training, I actually had videos where I was able to see what the doctors reported and then how the patients responded. And so, continuing in this vein of work, my research looks to uncover in what other ways or in what other contexts might this phenomenon actually be functional. And towards this end, I'm going to share some of my newest work that positions the imposter phenomenon as a functional moderator in one of the oldest equivocal relationships in organizational behavior. So, specifically, the relationship between role overload and effort. And I'm going to dive into that a little bit more shortly. And we're going to connect that to job performance, as we often really care about, okay, but even if you're doing more effort or less effort, how is that actually affecting your performance at work? So let's jump in. So, role overload is a stressor that is defined by the perception of having too much to do in too little time. It's a stressor that has attracted a lot of scholarly attention. You've probably been in positions where you've experienced role overload at some point during your careers. And over the past several decades, scholars have really dove into this concept. So they've sought to understand what are the predictors of role overload, what are its individual and organizational correlates, so when is it more likely to arise or co-occur with, and what are the consequences of role overload. Of great interest for a lot of these scholars have been the seemingly equivocal relationship with effort. So, alongside a number of studies that have shown that, hey, when you have too much to do in too little time, you're actually going to exert more effort because you're trying to accomplish it all. There's also a number of studies to suggest that there's actually a negative relationship. So, actually, you withdraw effort when you're in a position of role overload. And even some studies that suggest, hey, there's actually no relationship between role overload and effort. We can't actually predict how you're going to respond from an effort perspective when you're facing too much to do in too little time. And so to reconcile these inconsistencies or make sense of, hey, some studies are saying a positive relationship, some studies are saying a negative relationship, scholars have argued that the existing work has overlooked the critical role of appraisal, such that there's some sort of individual factor here that makes you see role overload in different ways, as more or less challenging. And depending on whether you see role overload as something that's challenging, something to overcome, you might exert more effort. But if you see it as less challenging, you're like, this is actually just overwhelming, you might engage in less effort. Nonetheless, despite repeated assertions to this effect in the literature, its consistency with stress and appraisal theories, as well as repeated calls from scholars to identify what is that factor that makes you see role overload in different ways, which might explain why people respond differently from an effort perspective, we actually know very little about who responds to role overload with increased effort to the benefit of performance and who does not, responding with decreased effort, harming performance. And so it's against this backdrop that I look to identify the imposter phenomenon, or what I call workplace imposter thoughts, which we're going to walk through exactly why I'm using that terminology in a bit, as a key moderator in this relationship between role overload and effort. So essentially as a differentiator to explain when is the relationship between role overload and effort going to be positive, which is good for performance, and when is it going to be negative, which is bad for performance. And over the course of the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to look to sort of build this theory with you all. So to get there, to give you a sense of what I hope that we can accomplish together over the next 50 minutes, I'm going to spend some time talking to you about what I mean by workplace imposter thoughts and why I'm using that terminology. I'm then going to sort of engage with the theory with you all to sort of explain like why I might be proposing these different relationships. I'm also going to talk about well-being here because when we're thinking about being a person at work, it's not just about performing well, it's also about thriving at work. So we're going to talk about what are the implications for well-being here. I'm going to run through a couple studies. So a lot of my work pairs field studies. So I actually work with companies, and then I usually also run experiments so that we can look at causality, and then talk about the theoretical and practical implications. And again, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, if you have any comments or questions in the chat, feel free to put them in. I'll be able to monitor that as well. So, the imposter phenomenon has roots in clinical psychology that dates back to the late 1970s. It was first documented among a group of women, and since then, it's actually been found to be prevalent across genders, races, and occupational categories. Most of the existing research, and as well as sort of how we see it being talked about in terms of a popular press perspective, uses this really sort of affective or emotional lens. So it uses sort of terms like feelings of phoniness or a fear of being found out when defining this phenomenon. In contrast, however, if you look at the original work on this phenomenon, you see that scholars and researchers applied what is known or what is thought to be a more socio-cognitive lens. So essentially, when this phenomenon was first being defined, the scholars said that the central tenet of this phenomenon, or the key characteristic of this phenomenon, is this idea that people believe that others think they're more competent or intelligent than they think themselves to be. And maybe as a result of that, you might experience a fear of being found out. But the key characteristic is this idea of like, hey, you might be being overestimated in terms of your competence. And what's interesting is when you look at a lot of the research, including the research that's saying that, hey, this is a really bad thing to experience, so the research I covered way at the beginning of this presentation, you would actually see that what we've actually been studying is something much closer to fear, period, rather than something that actually captures this discrepancy that I think other people think I'm smarter than I think I am. And as a result, if we think about it from that perspective, it's kind of unsurprising that everything that we've heard about this phenomenon is pretty negative. Fear is not a great emotion to have. It doesn't feel great. And so as a result, yeah, probably a lot of negative consequences are going to arise from it. So in my research, I look to sort of bring us back to the original theory. And so when I talk about this phenomenon, I want you guys to be thinking about this definition, which is the belief that others have an overly positive view of one's talent or abilities at work. It essentially captures sort of two representations of the self, what one thinks others think of oneself and what one thinks of itself. And I'm going to pause there because it's kind of a mouthful. But what I really want you guys to be thinking about is this idea of overestimation. I basically think that other people think I'm here, but I think I'm more here when it comes to competence. And so there's essentially this gap where I think other people are overestimating me. And the reason I use the terminology of imposter thoughts is I want us to really center in on this definition and be very clear about what we're talking about today. And if you have any questions about that, please raise them. It's essentially this concept reflects a self-discrepancy around one's competence. So it reflects sort of those first 5 thoughts I showed you on the first slide, this idea of I think other people think I'm smarter than I think I am. So to build our theory or to sort of get at the meat of how workplace imposter thoughts, popularly known as imposter syndrome, can actually be functional, I'm going to integrate sort of 2 pieces of research and theory, and then actually show you how this plays out in the real world. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about imposter theory and research, and then I'm also going to talk to you about a very popular framework called the challenge hindrance framework that I think you might also have some personal experience potentially with. So I'm just going to give you some terminology to things you've probably experienced at work. And we're going to look to build sort of this model that's on the slide. And one thing I want to highlight here is presenting imposter thoughts as a moderator isn't just this like haphazard addition where I was just like, ooh, let's actually see if it interacts with role overload to affect effort. It actually came from sort of reading the literature and really starting to understand existing theory. So let's jump into the theory. And I'm going to try to go a little bit slowly here because it gets a little bit complicated. But again, please raise questions in the chat. So, following what is popularly known, or at least academically known, as the challenge hindrance framework of work stress, employees exert more effort in the face of role stressors that they appraise as more challenging, and they exert less effort in the face of role stressors that they appraise as less challenging. So, if we look at the case of role overload, which is going to be our focus today, what you can kind of see is that I'm going to either categorize role overload as more challenging, which is defined as a stressful work-related demand that can result in gains. So these gains might be tangible or intangible. So things like Me facing role overload might give me positive feelings. It might help me learn more, and I really care about learning. It might give me a path to success, and I really care about success. Or I might see role overload, which again is too much to do in too little time, as less challenging, which is essentially a stressful work related demand that presents no gain. So it doesn't seem to carry higher meaning or material benefit if I were to face it head on. And the thing about stressors is they can be either. So some people can see a stressor like role overload as an opportunity to get something valuable. Others might see facing it as like, no, it is exactly what it's defined as, a stressor, and it just brings me stress. So the question becomes, how does workplace imposter thoughts, popularly known as imposter syndrome, change whether you see role overload as more or less challenging? As in, it gives you a gain or it doesn't give you a gain. And to understand this, it requires first looking at what those with more frequent workplace imposter thoughts recognize as a valued gain. So, what do people who have these thoughts really care about versus people who don't really have these thoughts as much? So, in line with original theory, what we know is that those who experience workplace imposter thoughts are those who really tie their self worth to others' evaluations of them as more competent. So rather, they really care about the fact that, and are really concentrating on the fact that, hey, other people think I'm smarter. And that's sort of a central thing I care about. I'm motivated to make sure other people think I'm smarter. As such, a valued gain for people with more frequent imposter thoughts, popularly known as imposter syndrome, are indications that they're sort of maintaining this seemingly overly positive evaluation. So anything that allows me to preserve the fact that people think I'm smart and smarter than I think I am seems like a worthwhile thing to engage in. In contrast, those with less frequent imposter thoughts, so those who do not have imposter syndrome as much, don't tie their self-worth as much to others' evaluations of them as more competent. So this doesn't mean that they don't care at all about what other people think of them, but they don't sort of concentrate their self-worth on this fact that, oh my gosh, I need to maintain some view that other people seem to have of me. It's great to be seen as competent, but I'm not sort of running my entire life based off of what I think their competence is, and is this more or less than what I think it should be. As such, they sort of don't see indications that they're maintaining this seemingly overly positive evaluation as particularly valuable. So things are sort of facing stressors or engaging in certain activities at work that sort of preserve what other people think of them is not essentially their central driving force. Yes, we care about what other people think about it, but it's not sort of what's dominating my psyche as I sort of approach work. And interestingly, and what I'm going to argue here is that facing role overload is precisely going to be a situation that can allow an employee to realize the gains that those with more frequent imposter thoughts so value. So what I'm going to argue today is that essentially, if I'm someone who has more frequent imposter thoughts, that is, I am popularly experiencing imposter syndrome, I am going to want to face role overload because this gives me a way to preserve others' vision of me as particularly competent. And the way to sort of break this down and really understand why role overload specifically is I'm going to tell you that role overload, as I told you at the beginning, reflects a mismatch between what an employee thinks others expect of them and the capabilities they think they possess. So again, if the definition is I have too much to do in too little time, which is the definition of role overload, then that's basically saying, hey, somebody thought I could do this all in the time, but I'm saying I don't actually think I can get this all done in the time that I have. And so if we think about that definition, what it's going to say is that sort of facing role overload head on offers you an opportunity to show or to other people that they do have the capabilities that others expect of them. So if I do the things or I try to do all the things that I've been assigned to do in the little time that I have, it gives me an opportunity to potentially show other people that, hey, I'm actually pretty damn competent and that's pretty amazing. In contrast, not facing role overload sort of maintains a mismatch. That is, it maintains this idea that, yeah, you do have too little time or too much to do and too little time. And so maybe it doesn't make sense to face that. And maybe if you have less frequent imposter thoughts, you don't care so much because you're not sort of centered on around what other people think of you constantly. So, just to repeat that and sort of say it in a different way to sort of tie this logic, what I'm going to argue here is that when you have more frequent workplace imposter thoughts, role overload is going to be likely positively associated with effort because it gives you a chance to realize a desired gain, which is it gives you a chance to prove to others or show to others that you're pretty incredible, pretty competent. In contrast, if you're an employee who has less frequent imposter thoughts, role overload is likely to be associated with decreased effort because they're not necessarily going to see that there are valued gains from trying to overcome this. They're kind of like, yeah, role overload's pretty stressful. There's not actually a lot of upside to trying to sort of face this head on. And I further hypothesize that this interactive effect, so how role overload is being influenced by imposter thoughts, is going to extend to performance. So specifically, if you have sort of when employees have more frequent imposter thoughts, it's going to be role overload is going to be indirectly positively associated with performance through effort, because essentially more effort should lead you to do better performance. In contrast, when you have less frequent imposter thoughts, role overload is likely to be associated with decreased performance because essentially you're withdrawing effort and less effort at work should sort of negatively affect performance. But what about sort of well-being outcomes? So I've given you this whole story about, okay, imposter thoughts might be really useful precisely in those moments when you're feeling really overwhelmed at work, when you're like, there's too much to do and too little time. And imposter thoughts might help me sort of rise to the challenge and perform well. But what does this actually mean for your well-being if you're sort of putting in all this effort because of your imposter thoughts? And so, what I sort of want to talk about here is performance isn't only the downstream implication that we care about. We care about a lot of other things at work. Indeed, one other one that we really care about is your well being at work. And what some scholars would say and some theorists would say is that often performance and well being do not travel together. So, if something's good for performance, it may be bad for well being, and vice versa. Indeed, that's sort of what I'm going to argue here, which is essentially that, well, this prediction that they would sort of not travel together hinges on this idea that if I'm engaging in more performance, I'm going to be more burned out because I'm using up my resources. But interestingly enough, there is another argument in the literature, which is that sometimes when you sort of engage in something like effort, it actually is not depleting, it's enriching because essentially when you put effort into something, this might open up other opportunities to end up getting access to more resources rather than less. And so there are findings that are mixed. So there's some work to suggest, yeah, if you exert more effort at work, you're going to be more burned out. But there's some other work that suggests there's no relationship. And so what I'm going to sort of look at across the studies that I'm going to show you is sort of what is the well-being impact? So we can really understand, hey, is this performance gain that I'm telling you that comes from experiencing workplace imposter thoughts actually a good thing in the grand scheme of things if we care about also well-being? So let me sort of jump into sort of the research here. So the first study I ran to explore this question of like, can imposter thoughts be functional in the relationship between role overload and effort? I went to a company, and this was a legal outsourcing service provider. And I got access to 169 employees who participated in multiple surveys across time. So specifically at time zero, at baseline, I obtained baseline performance ratings because I wanted to be able to understand who were the high performers and who were the low performers. At time one, which is about 1.5 months later, employees gave ratings of role overload, workplace imposter thoughts, as well as some control variables or alternative explanations we'd want to rule out, as well as demographics. And then at time two, supervisors provided performance ratings. To give you a sense of what these sort of employees were doing is that in these surveys, they got various questions. So for example, when I wanted to sort of figure out what type or to what extent they were experiencing role overload, they would get questions like, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? I do not have enough time to get the job done well on a scale of 1 to 7, with 1 equals strongly disagree, 7 equaling strongly agree. For workplace imposter thoughts, they were asked how frequently did you have the following thoughts at work over the past 6 months? So things like at work, people important to me think I'm more capable than I think I am. Indeed, these are sort of the 5 questions that they were asked about imposter thoughts, which is popularly known as imposter syndrome. And this is a scale that I validated in my previous sort of research work. They were then asked to talk about sort of their effort at work. So they were asked to indicate to what extent they agree with statements like, I try hard to get things done in my job. Supervisors then provided performance ratings. So they ranked employees on a variety of measures. So an example is ability to get tasks done on time. And then there were a number of sort of alternatives I wanted to roll out. So, for example, maybe it's not imposter thoughts that's really sort of driving whether the relationship between role overload and effort is positive versus negative. Maybe it's something like low self-efficacy, which is just essentially low self-confidence. Or maybe actually it's really having to do with self-presentational concerns. So it's more about impression management than it is about this fact that I think other people think I'm smarter. Or maybe you might be concerned about like, hey, the ones who are having more imposter thoughts are actually just the high performers. And that's why we're seeing this positive relationship between role overload and effort. So those are all things I wanted to be able to explore. I also included a measure of burnout so we could sort of answer that question about like, hey, but is this good for well-being? So in terms of the model, what I really want to highlight here is, as expected, there was a positive interactive effect of role overload and workplace imposter thoughts on effort. So what that means is that essentially workplace imposter thoughts affected the direction of the relationship between role overload and effort such that it was in the following way. So if we look at the top line in red, which is dashed, what you see is that there is a positive relationship as role overload increases from left to right with effort. So the more role overload, the more they seem to engage in more effort. That's the sort of upward sloping line. In contrast, if you look at the solid black line, you see that essentially it's the opposite relationship for those who have less frequent imposter thoughts. That is, as role overload increased, those who had less frequent imposter thoughts seemed to withdraw their effort rather than pour it in. And this had implications for job performance as expected. So there is a positive relationship between effort and job performance. This little star means essentially it's significant. And this is essentially saying that, hey, whatever's going on here, so these relationships that I just showed you are actually mirrored in performance. So if I replaced effort with the word performance, you'd see the same pattern that essentially those with more frequent imposter thoughts are performing better as overload increases, while those with less frequent imposter thoughts are performing worse as role overload increases because of essentially the effort that they're putting in. So what does this actually mean? It sort of means in this particular sample at this legal outsourcing firm, I found that increased effort also didn't seem to come with negative well-being results. So what I first looked at is, okay, let's actually replace performance as the end outcome with burnout. And does what's going on with effort actually translate into burnout? There isn't a star here, so it was not significant. And this essentially means that it did not carry over. So what this means is increased effort for those with more frequent imposter thoughts did not seem to come at the expense of burnout. So they didn't seem to experience more burnout because they're increasing more effort. Moreover, I kind of was like, okay, well, maybe the relationship doesn't work through effort, but maybe just being in a position where you're having high role overload and being someone who experiences a lot of imposter thoughts, maybe that's just bad for burnout directly. I didn't actually find that to be the case. And so what does this suggest? It seems that in this particular sample, you saw the benefits of having more frequent imposter thoughts. It resulted in increased effort and increased performance in the face of role overload, but this didn't seem to come at a cost of burnout. So that's all well and good, but it raises sort of a number of questions. So what about other well-being outcomes that we might care about? So things like satisfaction, for example. What about causality? So what I've just showed you here is correlational. It's essentially, are there associations across surveys? But maybe it's actually not causal. So maybe it's not imposter thought specifically that's actually driving this relationship. And sort of what about the appraisal micromechanism? So I told you earlier, it has to do with the fact that, hey, it depends on whether you're seeing role overload as challenging or not challenging, but I haven't really given you evidence of that. So let me tell you what I did next. So what I did next is study two. This was an experiment. It was actually conducted at a university in the Northeast United States. You can probably guess what university it was. And the idea here was really to zoom in on this interaction of role overload and imposter thoughts on effort. And so this is what we did. We recruited 307 undergrads, and they were randomly assigned to one of four conditions. So they either experienced low role overload and then were exposed to having more frequent imposter thoughts, or they experienced high role overload and they had more frequent imposter thoughts, or the vice versa. So low role overload, less frequent imposter thoughts, low role overload, more frequent imposter thoughts. And essentially what we did is the following. We told these undergrads, hey, please come in for a partner study into this physical lab space. And they were told to expect to be one of two roles. So they either were going to be the worker, which is sort of role A, where they would work on the tasks, or they would be assigned to role B, which is that they could see sort of A's work and can send messages. And to really sort of reinforce this, when they came into the physical lab space, there was actually a curtain in the middle of the lab to suggest, hey, people on the other side of the curtain might be getting a different role than you were. In reality, everybody was assigned to role A. So it didn't matter on what side of the curtain you were sitting at your computer, everybody was assigned to the worker task or worker role. And then in part two, we told them, guess what? We've created an aptitude test. And this aptitude test is meant to inform your partner B of your capabilities on this final partner test that we're going to give you. And we really sort of played up this aptitude test to say, hey, it went through a lot of testing. It's really good for determining how capable you are. And then in part three, we had all the participants take part in our effort task, which is part of the final partner task, under the watchful eye of role B, who again is not a real person, is actually just sort of part of the experiment. And the idea of this is in this effort task, this is when we could sort of manipulate high and low role overload. So let me tell you how we manipulated imposter thoughts. That is, how did we get some participants to think, hey, other people are overestimating my competence, while others to be like, no, I don't really feel this. And so essentially we told them, okay, remember, you've been assigned to this role A role. As the individual holding role A, you're going to be completing a bunch of tasks, and these tasks really get at speed, numeracy, and spatial cognition. And before completing the sort of assigned tasks that you're going to do under the watchful eye of your partner, you're going to take part in an aptitude test. And whatever your score is on this aptitude test can really help shape role B's expectations of what you will be able to do on the final partner task. It was then, they then saw a whole sort of spiel about what is this aptitude test. It's a short form Mitaki nonverbal reasoning aptitude test, or what we call MINRAT. This is actually completely a false test in the sense of it was created specifically for this study. I'm originally from Minnesota. I was born and raised there. So that's why I was like, oh, it'd be fun to put Minnesota in there in the text. Again, they were reminded, hey, role B is going to see your results on this test. They then saw a bunch of really hard Mensa IQ questions. So essentially they saw questions like this that were like really hard to tell whether you're doing well or not well. And to really emphasize that, hey, you might not be doing as well as you think, After about 2 minutes, they had their screen turn red like this, and it was told, hey, are you sure? They were told, are you sure about your answers? Please select an answer for every question before time expires. And then they were told, hey, compared to other students like you, how well do you think you did on the aptitude test? If they were in the more frequent imposter thoughts, what happened after they sort of indicated how well they think they did is they were told, wow, you were really, really competent. So they got a score that was up to 91st percentile. And they were told, hey, lol, of course, MIT came up with an aptitude test, but wow, 91st percentile is super good. I feel like we're going to do really great on the next task. So again, really emphasizing here that, hey, it's pretty incredible what they're able to do. If they were in the less frequent imposter thought score, they actually got something that was either 2 percentage points higher than where they rated themselves, up to sort of average, which is like 56 percentile, a little bit above average. And then they got a message from role B that really emphasized this. So lol, of course, MIT came up with their own aptitude test. 56 percentile, we're going to work together on the next task. And so essentially what we're doing here is you just completed a really hard test. You're not sure how you did. Suddenly you're told, wow, you did amazing. And you know that there's other really smart MIT kids who did this test too. Or you're told, hey, you did okay, which you're like, oh, that's pretty consistent with how I think I did. So again, you're creating overestimation in one condition and not in the other condition. And then we manipulated role overload, right? Because the whole idea here is trying to see how do your imposter thoughts also interact with your overload, or essentially feeling like you have too much to do in too little time. So what we did there is if you were assigned to the high role overload condition, you were given this number transcribing task where you saw a bunch of numbers like 718, 719, and you actually had to type it up. So you write SEVEN space ONE, etc. And they were told, hey, transcribe all 300 strings here. They also had this progress bar that did not seem to move at all, no matter how many strings they put in. And then they also had this post-it note that would update randomly with, hey, here's another task after you finish doing this task, of other things that you can do. If you were in the low roll overload condition, you were told, hey, transcribe all 50 strings. You had a progress bar that did seem to move, and your post-it note didn't actually update. In reality, everybody had the exact same number of number strings. So it wasn't 50 or 300. You actually had the exact same number of strings, and everybody had the exact same amount of time to complete the same number of strings. So all we were changing here is essentially your perception of how much you have to do and how much time you have. And then this is sort of the key result that I really want to show you here. And essentially what you see here is that if you're in the less frequent imposter thought, so if we focus on the first and the third bar here, you see that as role overload increases, this bar is lower than this bar. So essentially what's happening is you are exerting less effort. You are transcribing fewer strings. But we see the opposite pattern if we're focused on the more frequent imposter thoughts bars. So these are the second and fourth bar. What you see is that as you move from this bar to this bar is taller. So essentially, those who are in the more frequent imposter thoughts high role overload condition are exerting more effort than those who are in the low role overload, more frequent imposter thoughts. So again, imposter thoughts seem to help you sort of rise to the challenge here and exert more effort. I then sort of also asked these undergrads in these conditions to tell me how they're feeling during this test. And what was really clear is that if you looked at, so if we go back to these bars, if you looked at the high condition, so this bar and this bar, first and fourth bars, people really talked about the gains that they would get. So they talked about, hey, it's actually kind of fun. I was pretty locked into the task. It did feel like a challenge. I was making progress, and it made me feel a little bit better about myself as I continued to sort of make progress here. If we focus though on the other bars, so the shorter bars here, the mismatches, so these are low roll overload, more frequent imposter thoughts, or high roll overload, less frequent imposter thoughts, the gains were less apparent. They talked about how they were feeling stressed. It was stressful. It was unreasonable, meaninglessly long, didn't feel invested. In fact, one participant was like, I hated it. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is, okay, this experiment gave us also an opportunity to look at well-being costs. So specifically, I was able to look at how much strain did people report, how much task satisfaction, and how their turnover intentions. That is, did they want to quit this task? And what we find is if we look at the first bullet point, I did not find that there was sort of an effect on strain. So it didn't seem to be a difference of strain across the four cells. So people reported the same amount of strain. In terms of satisfaction, it actually went in the opposite direction. So it's not that if you exerted more effort, you felt less satisfied. Rather, if you exerted more effort, you felt more satisfied. Similarly, with turnover intentions, the people who wanted to quit were actually not necessarily the more frequent imposter thoughts, high role overload condition. They actually were happy or didn't want to quit as they started sort of continuing with this task. And so what does this all mean? It sort of means that, hey, the increased effort from role overload for those with more frequent imposter thoughts did not seem to come with well-being drawbacks. Or another way of saying this is the decreased effort from role overload for those with less frequent imposter thoughts did not seem to come with well-being benefits. What about other things like maybe, hey, this experience of being in a position of facing high or low role overload and being sort of manipulated into having more frequent or less frequent imposter thoughts, maybe that affects your well-being directly, and we did not find that to be the case. So it didn't seem to affect your strain, your satisfaction, or your intentions to quit. So this is all well and good, and there's sort of some evidence to say, hey, what might be driving the fact that people with more frequent imposter thoughts are seeing role overload and exerting more effort might be because they kind of see it as a fun challenge. We don't actually have a lot of sort of quantitative evidence. So that's what I sought to get in study 3. And also maybe they see it in different ways. Maybe it's not actually about being higher, less challenging, more or less challenging. Maybe it's about something else. So what I did in study 3 is I recruited 200 employees. These are full-time employees based in the US. And they completed measures of role overload at work, their imposter thoughts at work, the extent to which they saw role overload as challenging or not, as well as sort of other alternatives. Maybe they're just people who have high promotion focus. So means that they're like really attuned to opportunities for getting things that they want. Or maybe they're more prevention focused oriented, which means that they're actually more attuned to opportunities or actually threats, whatever's the opposite of opportunity, threats to things that they care about. And that's actually what's driving the effect. And so to make this a little bit more concrete, I want you to sort of see the items here. So again, role overload, very similar to what I showed you before. They had items like the amount of work I do interferes with how well I get it done. Workplace imposter thoughts, again, the same scale I showed you before. Others think I have more knowledge or ability than I think I do. What's new here is challenge appraisal. So they were asked, for example, to what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? Although my work tasks and job duties may cause strain, I see them as a chance to show me that I can do more than I thought. So essentially this would say whatever stressor you're facing, you kind of have a positive outlook on it. Alternatively, maybe it's what's actually driving whether you exert more or less effort in response to role overload and your imposter thoughts. Actually has to do with the fact that you're someone who's focused on successes or you're someone who's preventing losses, and then a number of other variables we might care about. So to really understand if it's really this more or less challenging thing that essentially workplace imposter thoughts is shaping how you see role overload in a more positive or negative way, what we want to see is a positive relationship between role overload and whatever that thing is that we think. So I'm arguing it's challenge appraisals for those with more frequent imposter thoughts and a negative relationship for those with less frequent imposter thoughts. So again, what we're trying to create here is that sort of same like positive slope for one line, negative slope for another line. So to evaluate that, we just look at whether there's an interaction effect first before we can even plot what the lines would be. So prevention focus, there's no interaction effect. So that would mean that the lines are parallel, so there's nothing to plot. But for challenge appraisals, there does seem to be a significant interaction, and promotion focus, there does seem to be a significant interaction. But let me actually show you what they look like. So if you look at this side, challenge appraisal, what you are seeing is, hey, there's a positive sloping line, like what we care about, and there seems to be a negatively sloping line. That's very close to the pattern we're looking for. What that would suggest is that, hey, having more frequent imposter thoughts, which is this dashed line here, means that as role overload increases, you tend to see role overload as more challenging. In contrast, if you're this solid black line, so you're someone who has less frequent imposter thoughts, as role overload is increasing, you tend to see role overload as less challenging, which is again this downward sloping line. Promotion focus doesn't seem to be an alternative explanation. So it's not that essentially workplace imposter thoughts is shaping to what extent you're attuned to successes when you're facing role overload or not. And the reason for that is really coming from this sort of solid line here, which is essentially those in the less frequent imposter thoughts. It's pretty much flat. So what that means is there doesn't seem to be a relationship with as role overload is increasing, it's changing the extent to which you have more or less promotion focus. So putting that really concretely, what I just want you to take away from this slide, it's a little inside baseball here, is that essentially what is happening is that people with more frequent imposter thoughts are seeing role overload as more challenging, and that's why they're exerting more effort, which is resulting in greater performance. So essentially they're rising to that challenge. So to put this into a little bit more context, I don't know if everyone has access to the chat. If not, we'll try it and we'll see how it goes. But I want to sort of give you all a sense of how big is this effect? Like, how much does this actually affect the workplace? Like, is this just sort of a cute study, set of studies where we found, this cool relationship, but does it actually make a meaningful difference? So one of the best ways to sort of understand the effect sizes of research studies is to compare it to medicine, which we consider sort of the gold standard of research. And I want to sort of give you a sense of like, hey, the effect size I'm talking about across here is a correlation of about 0.20. So essentially that's sort of how big this effect is. And let's compare it to a couple things we might care about. So medicine has a lot of famous findings. One of the most famous findings, for example, relates the use of ibuprofen to pain reduction. So I'm going to read through all these four and kind of explain them to you. And what I'm hoping is that in the chat, you can type a number between -1 and 1 for each of these findings. So what I mean by that is, for example, for ibuprofen and pain reduction, if you think that ibuprofen is super good for reducing pain, you think that correlation is close to 1. You're like, yes, it definitely works. If you think ibuprofen doesn't work at all, you would say -1. If you think actually there's no relationship between using ibuprofen and pain reduction, you're going to be closer to 0. So let's try it out so that we can sort of compare the correlations for these findings versus sort of the effect size that I found. So let's consider ibuprofen and pain reduction. So do you think, and I'm going to give you a couple seconds for the chat, what do you think the relationship is between ibuprofen and pain reduction? So what I'm going to share with you all is that the correlation might not be as big as you think. So specifically, the correlation between using ibuprofen and reducing your pain is close to 0.14. So it's not completely 0. It does have some effect to reduce your pain a little bit, but it's not as crazy high as you expect. Now let's consider sort of another popular finding or sort of our intuition about how sleeping pills affect insomnia. So if you think sleeping pills really affect your insomnia, really reduce it, they're super effective. Again, you would think it's closer to 1. If you think they're not effective at all, you would peg it at -1. And if you think they have no relationship, it would be closer to 0. And for that one, it's actually 0.3. So it's actually a little bit better than ibuprofen. It seems to be a little bit more effective, but essentially sleeping pills are associated with a 9% reduction in insomnia. So what about sugar and children's behavior? This is one of my favorite ones to do. So do you think sugar leads to more rambunctious children's behavior, or it leads to sort of a less rambunctious children behavior? And for that one, it's actually surprisingly 0. For some children, the more sugar you give them, the more hyper they are. But for other children, you see the complete opposite effect. And finally, I'm going to talk about one that we probably were told a lot when we were in school, but this relationship between smoking and lung cancer. So how much do we think smoking really leads to lung cancer versus not, or what the correlation is, the association? And for that one, it's 0.08. So that's actually a very small relationship. But what I'm highlighting here is not to tell everybody, great, please start smoking. This is great. It's not really going to affect your lung cancer. In fact, actually, that's not true. Not smoking is one of the best things that you can do to prevent lung cancer. The reason I'm actually highlighting that finding is actually to show that small effects matter. So even if I were to show you a very small effect, essentially it would be quite you should still care, essentially. So even if it's a small effect, we should really care about what's going on. All right. So to sort of bring us to time, because I know we have a couple minutes left, what I really want to highlight here are sort of the theoretical implications and the practical implications. So what do I hope that you actually get away from this? So the first is sort of resolving contradictions in the role overload literature. So when does role overload result in increased effort? When does it result in decreased effort? Maybe it can help you sort of process your own experience with role overload and try to understand, hey, when did I actually rise up and try to get it done versus when did I withdraw? I think this work also sort of shows that there are more bright sides to experiencing the imposter phenomenon than we might think about. So this is just showing that, hey, it can be that really special ingredient when you're facing a lot at work. It also clarifies how the imposter phenomenon relates to performance. So one of the biggest questions that we've had in this literature is really understanding, hey, is imposter syndrome good or bad for performance? This paper kind of suggests, hey, it's a little bit complicated. It interacts with conditions at work, like role overload, and that's sort of what explains or what predicts whether you're going to be a high or low performer. And then finally, this sort of extends the challenge hindrance framework to really talk about, hey, what are the factors like imposter thoughts that can change how you see something as more or less challenging? In terms of the practical implications, or where I hope that you sort of take away from this, is that I'd love to move us away from sort of this narrative of overcoming our imposter thoughts and actually move us to, hey, am I actually in a context in which imposter thoughts is functional? And so we are often told, hey, you experience imposter syndrome. This is really bad for you. What this paper suggests is that's not always the case. It really matters what else is going on at work for whether you should sort of get rid of your thoughts or not. And the reason I really highlight this too is experiencing imposter thoughts can be really uncomfortable. And so what I want to do is actually get rid of this additional burden that we place on ourselves when we experience these thoughts by being like, oh my God, it's so bad to experience this. I need to kind of get rid of it. Instead, saying, hey, actually, it's pretty common to experience this, and maybe I need to get rid of it, but maybe I actually need to do a diagnosis about what's going on at work and see if I can actually leverage these thoughts for good. One thing I want to highlight here is managers beware. So I always put sort of a clause that I want people to be aware of. The point of this paper is not to say, hey, if I want to overload my employees, maybe I should only just hire those who have imposter thoughts. That is actually a really bad takeaway. In fact, if you look back at the study 2 bars I showed you, the bars were actually the same height for whether you were in the high role overload, more frequent imposter thoughts condition, and the low role overload, less frequent imposter thoughts condition. So it's not that you're getting some crazy amount of effort that you would otherwise not get. And so I don't want to sort of suggest, just to emphasize that, hey, that essentially you should overload employees and actually only highlight those who have imposter thoughts. So with this last slide, and then I'll turn to some questions, what I want to highlight is the next time you have imposter thoughts and you're feeling like you have too much to do in too little time, recognize that your thoughts might be the secret superpower that gets you to rise to the challenge. Thank you. If you're interested in participating in more research or sort of getting involved, or you work at a company that you think this research could be of interest, please feel free to use the QR code. And with that, I'll sort of turn to the chat and to questions. So there's this great question in the chat about, hey, there's an inverse relationship, that there might be an inverse relationship between imposter thoughts and self-confidence. in the sense that greater thoughts mean a greater reliance on the impressions of others. I would think anyone who's self-confident doesn't need imposter thoughts at all to succeed. So this is super interesting. Okay, so let me unpack this. So essentially what this is saying is, hey, wouldn't people who have imposter thoughts necessarily be people who are low in self-efficacy, which is low self-confidence? And so if you already have efficacy, having imposter thoughts isn't going to help you in this situation. What's interesting is efficacy or confidence doesn't seem to be to affect how you see role overload. So I did test in a relationship whether essentially if I replace imposter thoughts with efficacy, do I actually see that people with more efficacy rise to the challenge? I didn't actually find that to be the case. So that's something to note there. The other thing is one thing I also really want to highlight here is that people who have imposter thoughts are not necessarily people who are super low in efficacy. They're just lower than what they think other people think they are. So if we think about, especially in popular press or celebrities or people in business who often claim to have these thoughts, they actually tend to be pretty successful people. And so the question is kind of understanding or sort of starting to separate this idea of confidence because they're still confident. They're just not as confident as maybe they should be in some ways. I hope that helps, and please follow up if it doesn't. And also feel free to email me with questions as well. Any other questions? I know we're very close to time.
We do probably have time for one or two more questions, so please feel free to ask or raise your hand. We can also have people just talking out your question if you don't feel like typing it or are not able to.
And if you can't use the chat, there should be sort of a Q&A feature that might be working. I don't know if everybody can see that.
Chat and Q&A should both be working.
Thank you. And while we're waiting for that, I'm also going to type in my email because I know that people might be multitasking. It is the middle of the workday. So if it is helpful to sort of send me any questions or thoughts offline, please feel free to reach out. I will try to get back to you as soon as possible.
That was very interesting and gave all of us a lot to think about. I do want to remind everybody that it will take us a few days to get the recording ready to put on City Channel 4, but after that, it will be up for a month. There was a lot of information in this presentation, so if you'd like to review it, it will be up as soon as staff can get it prepared. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be here and really excited about this programming. It's great to see that the city is doing this.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Very much
Awesome.
appreciated. And have a great day, everybody. Thank you for attending. And look out for the next webinar. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.